Welcome back to the Chronicle, the official film podcast for the People's Movies. My name is Paul. I am your host. I'm also the editor of the People's Movies. Welcome back to another new episode, which is episode 32. And if you love the movies, you're in the right place. As ever, every episode, my co-host today is Clotilde Chinnici. How are you, Clotilde?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing great. What films are we going to be reviewing this week?
Starting with Maxine, and then moving on to Fly Me to the Moon, who I actually need to check who directed that. No, Greg Berlanti. Yes.
Greg Berlanti. And there you go, folks. That's going to be your reviews for this week. And the first film that we'll be reviewing this week, Ty West's MaXXXine. That comes from Universal Pictures. Part of the X trilogy. The first film was X, and then it was the prequel Peril. We went from the 1970s to the 20s, I think it was, and we're now in the 1980s, 1985 to be precise. And this is the decade of glamour and glitz, Maxine. So Maya Goth is obviously returning as our titular character, Maxine. As I said, we first met her in the 1970s as wannabe porno star in X. A lot of people didn't realise she played Peril, the old woman, who was in X, and obviously became the start of the prequel, the second movie. As I said, it's 1985. Maxine is now in Hollywood, or Tinseltown. As I said, the glitz and glamour. And she wants to be that legit actress. What I liked about the beginning of the movie, Clotilde, was the Betty Davis monster quote. Forgive me, I don't have it written down in front of me.
It. Yeah.
That was probably the perfect quote for this type of movie. And it really set things up for like Maxine Peake, how she's went from an adult film star to now in the 1980s becoming a horror film star. And I loved at the beginning, it opened up with, it was very 80s, and it opened up with the ZZ Top song, Give Me All Your Lovin'. It really set things up. It really set the tone of the film. Right away, we could see in the opening montage, there's a serial killer going around, the Nighstalker. This Nighstalker is a serial killer who just seems to be going around murdering wannabe young women who want to be film stars. Some of them might be in the sex work industry, be they're sex workers, or they're working in strip bars. There's little peep windows which we see that Maxine actually does while she tries to become wannabe legit film star. But as we gradually go along, we get to see that a lot of the girls who are getting, the young women, the women are getting killed, are actually friends or people who work in the same industry as Maxine. Gradually, we get to see the police start to get involved, and the police, they start to question Maxine. And if anyone has seen X, you'll know there's a bit of history behind the titular character. I'll have to say, if anyone knows, I wasn't the biggest fan of the first two films. I enjoyed the first one. The second one, yeah, it was good in a way. I liked this probably the best of the three of them. What I would call it a trippage of Tinseltown, the sort of dream, the dream of becoming an actor and an actress, blinded by that sort of glitz and glamour of Hollywood. Like X, to me, was sort of showing you, yeah, you maybe want to become that Hollywood actor or actress, but you'll do anything to get there, i.e. become even an adult film star, which in this film, Maxine actually quotes, yeah, you have to do anything to get me to become that star, and she's happy to move on. Peril, obviously, Maya Goth played her as an old woman in X, and Clotilde, I liked how no one really knew until someone in a review of X actually mentioned it was actually Maya Goth. I was one of those person who didn't realise that until later on. I don't know about yourself. Did you know that was Maya Goth in X? It was playing Peril.
Oh, I had no idea until I was told, as you said.
Yeah.
And I think that's quite interesting. That also volumes to the work that they did in makeup and to make her look so different. I think that's what adds a layer to it, doesn't it?
It does, and that obviously opened up the door for Peril. Even though it's a trilogy, it's a prequel. Obviously, Peril, we see her as a young farm girl from sort of German immigrant parents who just wants to live the dream. She's like They called it the demented Disney movie. She's like the Cinderella who wants to go to the ball. Obviously, in her case, she's obsessed with the silent movies, and I think it was the Follies that she loved to go and watch all the time. And it also there's a little bit of a Wizard of Oz there as well, you know. And it sort of opened up things how it was the rise of the classic Hollywood production studios. The talkies were coming on as well, and Pearl really wanted to be part of that. So obviously now we're in MaXXXine, the third movie. This is another slice of film history here. This is the birth of the home video, the rental stores, and like your Blockbusters. And it was also the birth of the video nasties, these banned horror movies, which for years, many of them, I believe an odd one is still banned. You knew if you wanted to see one of them, you knew where to go to get the VHS under the counter, you know, type thing. But it was also the birth of obviously like a lot of horror subgenres. And MaXXXine, to me, has a big Dario Argento influence in it. And films like the Black Gloves and the Bird with the Crystal Plumage, that's has a big influence, I think, on this film because it throws MaXXXine into that want to live that Hollywood dream. Whilst there's a serial killer who's terrorising those who live in Tinseltown. It's also gives that big Italian crime thriller, the giallo influence in there as well. The 1980s, especially in America, there was a big religious factor. There was a lot of this the conservative Christianity there. There's a lot, they believed that Hollywood was very satanic, and even the music, it was quite funny. There's D.D. Snyder, who was like one of the big glam metal rockers at the time. It was brought into court by these groups because men believed the rock music was satanic, and it shows them showing it is not satanic. It started the film, as I mentioned earlier, there's a montage. You get to see about the Nighstalker. You see the protests. You actually see the process at the door of the studio, which MaXXXine gets a part in the Hollywood film, which is directed by the character Elizabeth Debicki plays. Another thing about it is there's a big bit of voyeurism here. No, that's the giallo, the violence in the studios, the eroticism, the gritty visuals, the jazzy score. Here, the colour palette, the neon lighting. It's also a big neo-noir thing here going on here as well. Very thematically here, visually, the narrative, things going on here. I saw things like Paul Schrader's film Hardcore with George C. Scott in there, a bit with this sort of father daughter thing here. I won't say too much because it might be getting into spoiling territory here. Pete and Tom, just got a big thing in the film here as well, with the gratification, the sort of styling again over the lighting and that. There is one particular scene in the film. Once again, I won't talk too much about it in it, which actually plays to that. What did you think of MaXXXine, Clotilde?
I also quite liked it. I think it's really interesting to see how people kind of like rank it within the X trilogy.
Yeah.
I think we can call it that. Yeah, I really like her, and I didn't really like X. So for me, MaXXXine is better than X,
Yeah.
but not for this part. I think the aesthetic and just visual style of her is so iconic that I don't know, it's really hard to match. And like you said, all the references to old cinema and something like with the voice is so unique as something on the screen today. But MaXXXine was quite good. I liked how it goes more into the backstory of MaXXXine. I think that's something that for me was really missing in X. Or to be honest, all the characters I felt like weren't explored. So I was really happy to see that more in MaXXXine. And generally speaking, I think the characters are constructed a lot better, and the film is paced a lot better for me. I mean, I really like a character-driven film, so in that sense, I think MaXXXine works really well. I also think it's quite satisfying because we know her backstory, not her backstory, but we know where she began. It's quite satisfying to see MaXXXine now and see how she starts becoming star in Hollywood, and that's really interesting. I also really like the character of the director, Elizabeth. I think she's my favorite character. She was really interesting. I think obviously it's a sort of the extra version of directors. I think it's really fascinating how there's a lot of commentary on that, I think, on how like maybe directors think and how they view their work. And also she's a woman in the industry and how she kind of has to solidify her place in many ways. I thought that was it's very interesting as sort of a commentary on the film industry that obviously applies to the 1980s and the film set, but also in some level to today. I thought that was really fascinating. And I really like the religious sort of references. I think that's something that kind of ties the whole film together. Is like from the very beginning, there's like they start to be like quite subtle references to religion and like how Hollywood was viewed in such a negative way and like as a satanic thing, and specifically like people like Maxine who were in the sex work business. And I
Yeah.
think, also speaks to the time, but it's also just a very interesting thread that goes on for the whole film. And I found that quite interesting to see because we're talking about a horror film that reflects on the making of a horror film. So that's something that I think a lot of horror films do. And we see that with the Puritan too in Maxine, how horror films tend to go back very much to concepts of religion and satanic things. So I really enjoyed the reflection on that. And obviously it ties in with Maxine's backstory, so everything feels very organic there. It doesn't feel like it was just there to like kind of make a commentary out of it. It just feels very organic to the story. Um, so yeah, I really enjoyed that. I also, yeah, I think the film could have been better in some things. I feel like the third act feels a bit disconnected in many ways to the rest of the movie, and I'm not gonna say what kind of like the big twist is, but that reveal felt really underwhelming to me, partially because I think it's very obvious in the beginning, and partially because the way it's staged just feels extremely underwhelming. Like it's coming, and you know what's coming, and that
Yeah.
really undermines the whole surprise aspect of it all. But having that said, I do think it's a really good movie and a really good kind of conclusion of the franchise too, because this is clearly the kind of marks the end of Maxine's story as we know it, and whether or not there's going to be like something else in a similar fashion. I think this is pretty much it for the X franchise, and I think as an ending, it's just a very fitting conclusion, and I think people will be happy to see like Maxine's story progress in a way. I also thought it was really interesting how like cinema just keeps being the common topic in a way between all these films.
Yeah.
And that's something that I got to speak to Ty West about in my interview for discussing film, and that was something that he raised quite early on was how all these references to cinema become essential because we're in LA now, but they've always been there. Like it's always been a sort of trilogy about cinema, which I think is really fascinating because we all love cinema as well. It's something that I think many people can relate to, whether or not you want to make it into Hollywood or acting or filmmaking, the kind of that end goal and that love for the movies is something that I think people can really relate to, regardless of like how that is shaped in everybody's personal lives. So yeah, I think a good movie overall, but yeah, I find it very fascinating how it compares with the rest of the.
Even though I said I did
It's like
like, sorry, go ahead.
I think he's really one of those people that like you can tell how much kind of heart he puts into filmmaking, and like he did like his career is very fascinating because he's actually fairly low budget and he started with like this
Yeah.
idea and then it just in such a short time it just kind of exploded in a way, and
Yeah.
I think it's just very cool to see, especially because he loves it so much.
That's probably why Universal picked him up. How he can use the finances to a limited budget and create a very effective film. Even though I says I enjoyed this, I think one of the problems with Maxine is at times it ends up becoming too predictable. As
Yeah,
in, i.e., as you mentioned, the ending, something gets revealed in the ending, and if you're walking along, you can sort of guess, Narratively, I think it's a little messy at times, and I do feel at times it's more style over substance. That's I think criticism. I believe even these House of the Devil, some people are today are saying that is one of the problems with that film. even though I did really enjoy the film because it was quite arty. As in that, each of the films, I think, obviously, is including Maxine, is an analysis of humanity's desires for obviously fame and fortune, which we have mentioned.
Mm.
I will say there's nothing remotely scary about this film. I think this is more.
I agree.
I
It's a
think
bit like.
it's a bit like Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I think it's more
Yeah.
towards that, which does the same thing but from the 1960s. So obviously, if you enjoy all these films, maybe watch Once Upon a Time in Hollywood for the 60s, get into X for the 1970s, and then Peril to go back to the beginning. Maybe even watch Peril, Once Upon a Time, X, and then Maxine. Maybe that could be a good all day watch, because that could be if you really love that type of genre film. And I think if they were ever going to do another Maxine, it would be sort of modern time, maybe even getting into the sort of digital age of things. How cinema films could be getting made for the big screen, and then suddenly bang, they're on Netflix, they're on Prime Video, they're on whatever streaming service we do have. That type of thing. What I will say is, if you enjoyed X and Peril, you'll probably enjoy the sort of serial killer giallo side of things on Maxine.
I think so.
However, I think the film relies too much on the plot, and it feels at times very undercooked, maybe even a little bit disjointed. At times, if you do enjoy the nostalgia of the genre film, and I'll probably say that for all three of the films, you will probably dig this Maxine. Goth was very solid, very good. She was very good in this. But I think the sort of final platform she got, it sort of flatlines her actual performance in, because she was really good. I love Kevin Bacon. He was given it his Chinatown. He's Jake Gittis, and he did. He looked to Jack Nicholson, with a hat, and then eventually the sellotape over his nose when something happens to him. You can see he was hamming it up, big style. He was loving it. So he was really, really good. What rating? What's your final thoughts, and what rating for Maxine would you give?
So I give it a 3.5, which I think is decent. It's a good film, and I think people who like the trilogy will really like it. But I
Yeah.
have to say as well, I think it can exist as a standalone. In my screen, there were actually a few people who hadn't seen neither X or Pearl. So
Yeah.
I think that's also quite good, and it's quite interesting how these films can all exist as standalones. Obviously, they inform each other and they have references to each other, but yeah, that's it. 3.5.
Yeah, I totally agree there. I think each of the films can be watched without seeing any other film. Yeah, there is an odd scene. There's a scene in this where she gets delivered. Maxine gets delivered a tape, and it's something that happens in the first film. That's not really much of a spoiler. It just sort of sets up the sort of side of things. As I said, it's a solid film, but it's too predictable. But it has a lot of things in it. If you love the sort of style and panache of neo noir, your giallos, the video nasty sort of feel of things, you'll really, really, and obviously the music of the 1980s, you'll probably
Yeah,
dig.
that's great.
You'll probably dig Maxine with the nostalgia. Other than that, I'm giving it 3 stars. So you have it, folks. Maxine, we have 3.5 and 3 stars. And for the next review and the final review for episode 32 of the Chronicle will be Greg Berlanti's Fly Me to the Moon. Clotilde, would you like to tell us about the film, who's in it, if you liked it, if you didn't like it?
Absolutely. So Fly Me to the Moon is set in the 1960s in the US during the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union. And it follows two main characters primarily. Kelly Jones, who's played by Scarlett Johansson, and she's brought in as a marketing specialist to kind of fix NASA's public image after a series of public sort of, what's the correct word? Outreach, maybe. Yes. Some of the previous missions didn't go well.
Yeah.
And another character is called David, played by Channing Tatum, who's the director in charge of the newest mission, the Apollo 11. But he was also in charge of the Apollo 1 and previous mission that weren't quite as successful, let's say. He really doesn't want her help, essentially. his focus is mostly on the astronauts and on getting them to space. And for a big part of the film, he feels like she's kind of wasting his time and the resources, but they will have to learn to work together in order to kind of, help the moon landing each in their own way, if that makes
Yeah.
sense.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. I think it's something that's fascinating is how many films there are and have been about the space race. And something that's quite interesting maybe about this one is that in my memory, at least, is one of the first times that I don't see the astronauts as like the actual sort of main characters. Obviously, they're there and they're a big part of the
Yeah.
film, but we really follow sort of the people around there. And that's very cool because it's interesting to see sort of the whole working machine that is behind it. It's not just like um, the scientists or the astronauts, which are a big part of it. But it's quite interesting to see that there's a whole marketing and sort of PR side of it as well that I think is not often highlighted when it comes to the space race. And also something that I thought this movie did quite well, at least in the beginning, I think it gets lost unfortunately, is how it sort of ties in the Vietnam War, and I think it's easy to forget when we watch movies about the space race that that was
Yeah.
also happening
Yeah.
because it's they tend to have like such a tight focus on it that you don't have time to think about anything else. And I think it's really important how the two existed in the exact same time frame, and they sort of the Vietnam War is quite a big part of the plot, but it does come back here and then, and I think that kind of creates a very good feel of the time because you know things don't exist in a vacuum, and it's good that I think it's good that they did that in the script because it's really important to create the right image of what the 1950s in the US were. Having that said, I do think the movie has its issues. Like, just yeah, it definitely felt too long for me. I know it's like 2 hours, a little over 2 hours,
Yeah.
and I felt like it was way too long. And I think it's a sort of perhaps writing issue. There's so many like sequences that are very expositionary. It's like either Scarlett Johansson or Channing Tatum have a monologue about their backstory, which is all well and good. And I'm very happy to explore characters' backstories. I think they're really important, but it feels like they're being told to the audience rather than shown in any way. And I think it's very hard to like just relate to something or even just empathize with them if we don't see any of their struggles. Like they just tell each other things. And while I appreciate that is also the way people communicate, I think it makes for fairly boring storytelling. Like there's very little that we can actually connect with from what we see, especially when it comes to Kelly, Scarlett Johansson character. Her backstory is such a key point. It's brought up so many times.
Yeah.
But then, like, it feels so underwhelming because, like, we don't see any of it. Like, she talks a little bit about it, but that's it. Like, it feels like it's this, like, huge threat to everything, to her relationship with him and to her life as it is, too. But then, like, nothing comes from it. It's just a chance to give her a monologue about it, and it falls really flat, I think.
Yeah.
It's like, and that's very disappointing because I think the actual sort of story elements of their respective backstories were quite interesting. And obviously, he has the whole thing with previous missions that failed, and she has this also very peculiar backstory, and none of them really matter in the end because I think they're easily forgettable for the way they're delivered. I also didn't like the chemistry. I thought there was no chemistry really.
Yeah.
I think both of them do a good job, like individually, but I didn't see the chemistry. I just couldn't bring myself to really care for their relationship, which is very sad. But speaking of acting, I did really like Woody Harrelson as Mo in it. He was so good. Every time he was on screen,
Yeah.
it was such a joy to watch. It's like he can steal. I mean, he's great. We all know that, but he just steal every scene he's in, and he's really brilliant in this character. I think feels like he had a lot of fun with it too. Like
Yeah,
it's
yeah, he did.
quite a really great villain that you also kind of like, right? He's such a joy to see on screen, as I said. And I also really like Ray Romano as
Yeah,
Henry. I think he brings the emotions that I felt lacking in the main couple. To me, he brought that in his scenes. He was just so good. He's another one that I was just kind of waiting to see more of.
yeah,
Um, I like that very much. I do also, it feels kind of weird, right? Because part of me really likes that the film focused on this like marketing roles, but at the same time, it feels kind of weird because obviously there's only Kelly and her assistant that do that, and also like they're essentially the only women characters that we actually see. Like there's a
yeah.
couple more extras, but they aren't even named. And it feels a bit weird that the only female character of relevance are in the non-scientific, non-technical roles. I know that obviously historically there weren't that many women at NASA and at the time, but it's still disappointing to me. Like there's films like Hidden Figures that are also historically accurate that showcase the role that women played in the space race, and I just wish it had done that a little bit more because it's probably unintentional, but showing that women's place in this film in terms of the space race is only like in more traditional women professions like marketing and public relations. It's quite disappointing, and I think it's really old in 2024. Like, surely we've moved past that, but I understand it for the purpose of the movie. It was just something that I didn't really love. I think they could have done. They could have done that really differently. But yeah, I mean, it's a good film in terms of like creating the sort of idea of the time and like the atmosphere of the space race. But at the same time, I do feel like there's better movies on the space race and there's better romance movies. What's perhaps a bit unique about it is how it brings the two together. But there's that. I mean, it's not a bad movie, but it's just like kind of there.
I was actually surprised that I actually enjoyed some of it. That doesn't mean to say it's a great film or anything like that, because usually the rom-coms, or I think they were calling this a rom-com screwball. Yeah, some of this sort of screwball comedy did work. As you say, I think the chemistry between Kelly and Mo Barkis, Woody Harrelson's character, was more stronger and believable.
True. I
Yeah,
agree.
they might even have done the romantic side there, because when you start to learn about Cole, Channing Tatum's character, the idea probably could have worked. I mean, Ray Romano, he's got probably one of the most recognisable accents out there. I mean, anyone that's seen any of the Ice Age movies, is it the Woolly Mammoth? It's just called something Ray. I can't remember it. He's highly recognisable, his accent, and it was good to see him sort of playing yeah, it was comedic, yeah, but it wasn't 100% totally comedic. The thing that I thought even the last film we just reviewed, Maxine, might have done a bit with Elizabeth Debicki's character, and you sort of mentioned there wasn't many women in the 1980s, and even obviously there's more female filmmakers nowadays. Back in the 80s, there was probably virtually none. It was like a sexist type of industry, and that's probably why a lot of the actresses of the time, the nobodies, well, some of them did become someone. The films were so bad because they came from the sex industry, type thing. I liked how at the beginning where Kelly walked into the meeting, and it showed that sort of sexism that they did have in the 1960s type thing. That these guys sitting around in their suits and talking about nothing basically. The only time a lady should be in the boardroom is to serve them tea or take notes type thing. That sort of sexism they had in that generation. They did have a lot of sexism in the 1980s as well. Sexism, obviously, is still around, but obviously nowadays it's getting singled out, and people, if you do it, which you shouldn't do, you're in trouble. The thing that I liked is Mo Bacchus sort of showed, yeah, Kelly had the gift of the gab. She knew how to what to say, how to influence these guys. which was at the time was basically like a man's world. She knew how to influence him in her way. And how her accent, how she could change the accent like to like a Southern belle from a
We like that, yeah.
New Yorker type thing, that. Cole, Channing Tatum is very stoic, very, very emotionless. I think he was like your typical soldier and military person, who very honourable in his job, very superstitious. The cat thing was all right at the beginning, but I get a bit played this joke too much type thing, that type of thing, and it was pretty predictable when it came to the actual fake moon landing setting that something was going to happen. And it was also predictable when we met Jim Rash, who played Lance Vespertine, the very camp filmmaker.
He's fantastic.
He's good. He's probably one of the main him and Woody Harrelson are probably two of the main highlights.
Absolutely.
In this show. You knew right away when we met Kelly at our office, when he came in, you knew what was going to happen. If anyone knows the story of the so-called theory behind the fake moon landings, you know there's a certain filmmaker who does get a mention in this film. I liked how they played a little joke on that. Sorry, I'll just say the name, Stanley Kubrick. It's not really a spoiler if you know that. Interesting how they use that side of things to do with space. It's not always your sort of typical setting for a rom-com or any sort of romantic type of thing. As I said, it takes little digs at the conspiracy theorists. I found it very unusual at that time, 1960s, a character like Lance being openly gay and not getting into trouble, because obviously, especially in America and around the world, here in the UK as well, there was laws in if someone, even though it was seen more to men, the men, if you were openly gay or you got caught with a place, you were arrested, you were jailed. Alan Turing's probably one of the most famous gay men who obviously things that were sitting in front at the moment. If it wasn't for Alan Turing, we might not have computers. I think in the days, back in the 60s, into the 70s, even the 50s, there was very camp characters, but they were on TV, they were in films where people just accepted, it was very open, So I liked that sort of side of things. Yeah, it was light-hearted, a wee bit charming. There was the odd funny joke there. Was it engaging? At odd occasion, especially with the characters that did what. It was inoffensive, I'll say that. Kellen Backus probably should have been the romantic side of this. So, what's your final thought? Yeah. What's your final thoughts on Fly Me to the Moon, and what sort of rating would you give it?
I end up giving it a 3. I think it's like it's a good film if you've got kind of like low stakes.
Yeah.
Chill. I mean, they do build up the tension quite well in some bits, but I think it has some kind of structural issues that I can't get past.
Yeah.
Having that said, I didn't necessarily feel like it was a waste of time. I still, sat there, laughed at some of the jokes. It's just there.
Yeah.
So yeah, I gave it 3 stars. I do think if it had been shorter, it would have been better. There were some things that could have been cut, and if it flew better, then that would have changed a lot.
Yeah, I'm 3 stars as well. I mean, it had its moments. I can see why it's going to be a limited release in cinema. Not a limited release as in it's only going to certain cinemas. I think it's only going to play a certain time. Even though it's Sony Pictures, it's Apple. It's an Apple original film, so it's eventually going to go onto that streaming service. And I probably believe it might be better going directly onto Apple. It might do a wee bit better. It's going to do better. It's probably going to get better. There's a lot of things that worked. There was a lot of things that didn't work. But as in, if you're flicking through something to watch on a lazy day, yeah, it's probably going to do the job. So you have it, folks. Fly Me to the Moon, which is in UK cinemas, soon to be on Apple streaming service. We both give it 3 stars. And there you have it, folks. That is a wrap. That is your episode 32 of the Chronicle. Thank you very much for joining me. Thank you very much to Sony and Universal and obviously Apple for letting us review Maxine, and Fly Me to the Moon, which are now both in UK Irish. And if you're from overseas, it will be in many regions as well. Here, we're now on Podbean, so that obviously gives the Chronicle a wider scope where you can actually find your episode. Obviously, you'll find it on the People's Movies, but obviously you can go to one of your favourite podcast sites to download, things like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube, Castbox, to name a few. Clotilde, thank you very much for joining us. Can you let the people know where they can find you on social media and any websites where they can find any of your reviews?
Absolutely. So I'm on Twitter at Films with Chloe and Letterboxd, and Instagram is at The Perks of Being Chloe. And I write obviously for the People's Movies, as you know, and for Loud and Clear Reviews as well, and Movie Marker and the Film Magazine, and others that I won't mention because otherwise we'll be here for a long time. So recently interviewed Ty West for Discussing, which I think is an interesting read if you're interested in Maxine.
Good. So is it already on Discussing Film's website?
Yes.
Excellent. So anyone liked Maxine or interested in Ty West, go and have a little read of that. As for myself, at Facebook, it's The People's Movie. At X Twitter, it's at The People's Movie as well. You can find us on Instagram at The People's Movies and Pinterest at TPM_UK. We will also at times continue to chat over at the Chronicle Take 2 to find out when any episodes may appear. Keep an eye on social media and at People's Movies, and obviously if you're on any of their favourite podcast websites, keep an eye on there. Obviously, you can also sign up for the email newsletter, which you can do over at the People's Movies. You can obviously support the Chronicle and the People's Movies with a Buy Me a Coffee and at PayPal. You'll also find those links obviously over at the People's Movies. You can share the podcast on social media and with your friends and family. And if you're listening to one of those popular podcast websites, please do drop us a rating and a little review. Thank you, Clotilde, for joining us. And thank you for joining us. Until the next time, enjoy the movies.